After 20 minutes at the hands of the mercenaries, the bar of the pale blue dot now more closely resembled Earth in its final days. In other words, a lot of it was on fire, and everyone was trying to leave as quickly and as quietly as they could. Toward the back of the room, the majority of the establishment's patrons were gathered. Several were gagged or bound somehow, and many more knocked unconscious, or, as in the case of exotic dancer Zeebo, the horn-toothed squid, had been shot dead. The captives were currently being guarded by a giant worm, whose slime was both highly acidic and impenetrable. The rest of the space station was busy being systematically and thoroughly scoured by several dozen soldiers, each of whom was armed to the teeth, or actually had arms made of teeth, as was the unfortunate biological makeup of the Schneebly system's molar molenoids. From the bar lobby, one could hear the shrieks of guests and interrupted lovers, using their final moments in this multiverse to complain.
Hadn't I put the bloody do not disturb sign up?
And such things as,
Look, I know the pale blue dot's hardly the 5 seasons, but buggeration if this isn't the worst room service I've had in my entire...
But the poor wretches never got to finish that thought. In fact, the only resistance still holding out against the attack was that of anarcho-punk band, the Legionnaires of Sin. The Legionnaires, thankful now more than ever for their infinite lineup of reinforcements, had entrenched themselves behind a hastily constructed barricade of bass drums, subwoofers, amps, preamps, guitar pedal boards, keyboards, and, unfortunately for them, even their precious rider. As the shots from the mercenaries' antimatter quasar blasters ricocheted off the barricade, hundreds of bottles of snail ale, clam pain, and sea keela were destroyed in a fine spray of ocean-themed alcohol. Of the moans coming from behind the barricade, only 1 in every 10 was actually related to physical injury. The rest were simply mourning such a waste of booze. Distracted by their fight with the Legionnaires, and with most of their company searching for the fugitive Khan elsewhere on the pale blue dot, not one of the mercenaries in the lobby noticed Jahanara and Glorfindel, now a ripe shade of peach, as they quietly approached the splintered wreckage of the bar. Psst, hissed Jahanara, pulling Glorfindel's attention back to the task at hand. You want out of here alive, or not? The pair were hid behind the corpse of a giant Venus flytrap, and as Glorfindel turned to face their companion, a stray blaster bolt hit the heaving remains, spraying the extraneously conscious light orb in a fine shower of viscera. Glorfindel turned the colour of diseased snot.
Ooh,
said Jahanara, before she could stop herself. She reached up and pulled a sodden bar mat from the polished wooden surface. She flung it at Glorfindel, who, not having any hands to catch it with, suddenly found themselves blinded, wet, and smelling even worse than before. Decades of spilled drink, never once washed out of the bar mat, now coagulated on Glorfindel with the horrid stench of the decaying Dionia. Glorfindel shuddered, tilting on their axis until the towel fell free and hit the floor with a sound like mouldy leaf mulch. The orb cycled through their colour palette until they found one which conveyed a suitable degree of rage.
Sorry, Glorf,
apologised Jahanara, half-heartedly.
Anyway, what do you want?
The flying insectoid motioned toward the menu, pale and blue-tacked onto the mirror behind the bar. In all the years Jahanara and Glorfindel had been coming here, it had never changed. The pale blue dot's menu offered just 2 astronomically gastronomical choices. After an unnecessarily long period of deliberation, Glorfindel finally answered Khan's question.
Just the usual,
they decided, with a satisfied nod.
But I still don't understand.
But Jahanara had stopped listening. With a quick peek over the dead flytrap to confirm that the attentions of the mercenaries still lay elsewhere, she flew up to the bar, or rather, what was left of it. The old saloon-style brass rail which had run the length of the bar at just the right height for bipedal customers to rest their weary feet upon, was now so bent out of shape that it sooner resembled an incomprehensible modern art piece than a footrest. And that was just the half of it. The once polished surface of the bar, lovingly cracked and weathered by millennia of disrepair, had been thoroughly thwacked and leathered in just a few milliseconds of wanton destruction. The area between the tattered bar and the cabinets behind, once showcasing many metric tons of knock-off booze, now showcasing many metric puddles of knocked-off booze, was a living catastrophe of splintered wood, shattered glass, and variously strewn robot parts. For a moment, Jahanara worried that her plan had been foiled at the first hurdle. She caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror, itself somewhat miraculously undamaged, and recognised the kindling of fear-induced sunlight in each of her 100 eyes. Shit, she thought, her thoughts flashing in big red warning signs for Glorfindel to see. She licked frantically at the goo weeping from the corners of her eyes, and soon had herself back under control. She prayed that no one else had seen her. As her vision became clear once again, she saw to her enormous relief what it was she'd come looking for. For there, among the wreckage, lay the AI barkeep who had served her earlier. His wheel had come loose, and the funny screw and bolt fixings of his arms were battered all to hell, but still he lived. And as he caught sight of Jahanara, he lived to serve.
Howdy, 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 howdy do, little miss, little miss, little miss.
Amidst the cacophonous rattle and volley of gunfire, the thundering tones of the Texan throwback automaton didn't travel particularly far. Jahanara flapped her wings nervously, all the same.
Looks like I done found myself in a bit of a pickle. Yee-haw! I'm feeling mighty drawn towards that big sunset in the desert, miss. Sure is getting awful cold in here.
Jahanara pulled an awkward face. Gee, shucks. Yeah. Sorry to hear that, mister. What did you say your name was?
The name's Clarence, kind miss. But my friends call me Clarence. Geez, fetch a feller a blanket, would you?
The robot bartender called Clarence was now visibly shaking. Yeah, totally. No issue, reassured Jahanara, scraping the impressively shallow depths of her empathy bowl. Just, if it's not too much hassle and all, we were wondering...
I wasn't,
interrupted Glorfindel, still evidently pissed off. Well, I was wondering, excusing the imposition, if you wouldn't mind fetching us something first? Clarence the AI barkeep smiled faintly, a row of piano teeth wobbling threateningly in his aluminium skull.
My, do you remind me of my good lady wife?
You have a wife? Asked Jahanara, with a mixture of incredulity and genuine curiosity.
Oh, sure. Pretty as a darned peach she is. Waiting for me back on the ranch, too.
The ranch was an orbiting holding station for refugee farmers, made homeless by the infamous intergalactic crop blight of the 43rd millennium AD, according to the Homo sapiens calendar, that is, for it was, in keeping with their track record, the genus Homo sapiens sapiens who had brought said blight to the galaxy in the first place during their evacuation from Earth. Glorfindel, growing increasingly anxious as the screams of wounded and dying aliens filled the air of the space station lobby, watched as Jahanara's thoughts filled the air. Jesus H. Christ, next he'll be telling me he was on the brink of retirement.
Hell,
snorted Clarence.
I was but 3 measly days from retirement, too.
He laughed a sad sort of laugh.
Just about had the money to find me and Miss Clarence and Clarence Jr. a new home, too. Darn and blast it.
Whilst Jahanara listened impatiently to the swan song of this curious relic of Earth's final years, the door to the lobby from the upstairs rooms swished open. Pushing along a beleaguered pair of entwined electro-eels by the muzzle of their thought gun, a soldier entered the room. The soldier was about 9 feet tall and was formed entirely of molten lava. A species which neither Glorfindel nor Jahanara had ever encountered before, and not the sort of species one wants to be surprised by in a situation such as theirs. Jahanara swore colourfully, a rainbow of vulgarities patterning Glorfindel's vision. Right, Clarence, my man, I am truly freaking sorry, okay? But I need a solid right now. Please, please, tell me you're still serving lunch. The question, out of context and concerning the nature of Clarence's hospitality, snapped the dying robot from his reveries. A quiet light returned momentarily to the bulb of his ocular socket.
Lunch, you say? Why, yes, indeed.
Jahanara, Glorfindel, and anyone who had ever patronised the pale blue dot had heard the coming spiel innumerable times before.
Here, on the margins of the Milky Way, you bass know what lunchtime means. There's always time for pork and beans.
The pieces of Jahanara's plan moved closer in alignment.
Now,
Continued Clarence.
what'll it be? Pork or beans? Hoo-wee, you're making me hungry.
Right then, 3 things happened at once, followed by 3 more things in quick succession. Firstly, the molten lava mercenary, attracted by Clarence's hospitable hollerings, identified the hovering insectoid at the bar as the fugitive wanted dead or contrived by the Inter-Galactic Council of Sentience, and the light orb cowering nearby as a known accomplice. They raised their thought gun and took aim. Secondly, Jahanara, a glint of success in each of her many eyes, completely oblivious to the crosshairs slowly aligning themselves with her body, ordered 2 portions of pork with 2 side portions of beans, and nodded satisfactorily. Thirdly, Glorfindel, the extraneously conscious light orb, being the only one to have noticed the newly directed attentions of the thought gun wielding magma monster, accidentally farted. The cloud emitted from the microscopic valve which served Glorfindel as both mouth and anus was a baffling array of colour and light, and actually went some way to camouflaging the embarrassed trumpeter. These 3 simultaneities were closely followed by the following. Firstly, Clarence, the long-suffering barkeep, husband to a migrant wife, father to a migrant son, who would never have his retirement, not in this life nor the next, uttered the words Jahanara had heard in her mind's ear when she'd first dreamt up her plan.
2 pork, 2 beans, coming right up. Yee-haw!
Secondly, the molten lava mercenary, drawing the attention of its colleagues to the fugitives with a terrible war cry, the sound of which would have curdled the Canadian curds of the planet Poutine, secured Jahanara and Glorfindel in the dual crosshairs of its thought gun, and fired. And thirdly, as the fat-ass rays of the thought gun whizzed and gibbered through the air of the space station lobby, Jahanara and Glorfindel's perception of space-time slowed to 1/100th of a second. Jahanara turned at last to take in the scene unfolding, and breathed a sigh of relief. Heck, that was closer than I'd planned. Leisurely, she winged her way off the bar and down to Glorfindel's level, trying not to screw up her face too much at the combined stink of plant remains, stale beer and flatulence which now surrounded the orb. The blast from the thought gun drifted lazily through the air where seconds ago Jahanara had been perched. Glorfindel shook.
Where's... Jahanara, what's happening?
Oh, it's simple, really, Jahanara beamed, more pleased with herself than ever before. Time never moves slower than when you're waiting for food. A question for you, children. Have you ever contemplated the fly? If not, don't worry. It's not a test. I mean, I certainly hadn't ever really thought of flies, until recently, that is. But if you have, if you've mulled over mosquitoes, thought of ticks, or asked after aphids, then perhaps you were inspired to do so for a similar reason. You see, it was a hot summer's evening, and the porch door was swinging creakily on its hinges. The temperatures both inside and outside the house were identical, but still I kept that porch door open, hoping that some semblance of breeze might somewhere muster, and thus aerate my home. I was taking a nip of Ursa Majoran mezcal, the only true companion in that sort of humidity, of course, when my cat Xander came stretching out onto the porch to join me. She went from downward-facing dog to upward-facing dog, then held my gaze, wide-eyed as she wrung the tiredness from her with a final stretch. Suddenly, Xander caught sight of a big fat bluebottle twitching lazily on the ivy-covered trellis at the end of my porch. And so I watched her, my sprightly 2-year-old cat, as she crept panther-like up to the lattice, sometimes localizing movement to just the tip of her tail, other times taking 2 or 3 measured darts forward. I watched her reach the trellis and wind herself up like a springbok, and then, at the very last moment, when she was sure that the fly was distracted, I watched her pounce. She flew through the air at the fly almost faster than my eyes could move, and yet the fly had escaped. Not only that, but it had escaped and then returned to that same bit of trellis, just a handspan from where it had been, and it had done all of this as nonchalantly as if, like in some slapstick movie, it had simply dropped a coin and bent to pick it up, just as the assassin took a swipe at its head. Sipping my mezcal, wiping the sweat from my brow, I watched Xander line up again, from a different angle this time, and yet fail once more. The fly buzzed loudly, disgruntled, and flew across the porch decking, spying out its next landing pad as carefree as if it had been picking holiday destinations from a brochure. 15 minutes this went on, and the closest my cat Xander ever got to dining on delicious fly was when she mistook a fallen nugget of my chewing tobacco for her prey. I'm sure it tasted as nice as any fly could have anyway. All the while, the fly just kept on going, swimming through the air with all the grace its plump posterior could muster, dodging the lightning-quick swipes of Xander as easily as one might navigate the odd floating turd in the lazy river on Aquatica, the water park planet. It occurred to me then that, given time is relative to mass and speed and gravity and all, that the fly's perception of time was drastically different to that of my cat Xander's. In fact, to the fly, Xander's ninja swipes were rather predictable and enthusiastic affairs. To put it in terms we might better understand, whilst to us it looks as if the fly moves so fast it could cross a road full of speeding cars and emerge unscathed, in fact, the speeding cars are, to the fly, more like overweight cyclists, whose bikes are stuck in second gear and who have recently suffered the unfortunate loss of both feet. Relative to us, the fly moves incredibly fast, but for the fly, we being relative to it, we move as slow as slugs. This, then, was how time felt to freelancers Jahanara Khan and Glorfindel, the extraneously conscious light orb, as Clarence the AI bartender rummaged through the wreckage of the pale blue dot in search of a couple of cans of pork and a couple cans of beans.
That really it, then?
Asked a gobsmacked Glorfindel.
You steal the one extant standard by which the universe measures intelligence, alter it for your own personal gain, thus increasing or decreasing or, I don't know, just messing with the IQ of an entire universe of life, and your big escape plan is to order dinner.
Jahanara grinned. Hey, it worked, didn't it? The lobby of the pale blue dot looked rather strange, slowed down, which is not a particularly accurate phrase regarding the infinitely complex quantum network of space-time, but it'll just have to do. The mercenaries sent to get Jahanara, dead or contrived, whatever that meant, looked, well, stoned. As the lava thing's shots rang through the bar, the sound waves now too stretched to be audible to Khan and company, its companions in arms had all started toward her. Several were reloading their firearms, several more already raising them to aim, but whatever they did it so slowly that they looked simply clumsy. And so, to Jahanara, it looked like they were stoned. Gently, she moved Glorfindel out of the path of a light beam as it flashed from the muzzle of an astronautical rifle. Problem with most modern science is it's done by people who aren't quite smart enough, explained Jahanara soberly. They look at a problem like ours and they'd go straight down the route of complex mathematical equations, diplomatic bargaining, philosophical reasoning, linguistic manipulation, biological reprogramming. Glorfindel screwed up their foggy face, unsure whether Jahanara knew where this was going. Look, the point is, she said, they often fail to see the most obvious solution, the one staring you right in the face.
Like ordering dinner to slow down time.
Right, exactly. I was just sitting there, you see, right before you came along, thinking about how hungry I was, and how stupidly long it always takes this place to reheat either of the two options on the menu. And then, later, right when we needed it, I remembered that, and I knew it's what would get us out.
Mm-hmm.
Glorfindel imagined what it might be like to have fists. Specifically, they imagined what it might be like to have fists and to find one of them lodged at the back of Jahanara's invertebrate skull. They took a deep breath, the mist of their orbs swirling from red into a cooler, slightly calmer purple.
Speaking of getting out, do you think we could...
Oh, said Jahanara, as if suddenly remembering about the tea she'd left steeping. Oh, yes, of course. The pair were at the door of the airlock before it occurred to them to clean up the mess they'd left the poor old Dot in. They'd been patronising the place for decades, after all. It would hardly do if the station went out of business on their account. And so, one flying, one hovering, both moving like that fly did in and out of the flailing cat paws that were random shots firing from a chorus of space guns, Jahanara and Glorfindel set about freeing the mercenaries' captives and disabling the mercenaries in the process. Over the lava soldier, Glorfindel unleashed a miniature typhoon of rain, which is to say, they evacuated the stored condensation of their inner mists in a biological excretory process we might recognise as urinating. Down the gullet of the giant, impenetrably skinned guard worm, Jahanara shot her very last dose of ouch-bred scorpion poison. Several mercenaries had their own guns turned on them, just as they were squeezing the trigger, and several more were simply stabbed or bludgeoned. Glorfindel even orb-butted a particularly stubborn customer with a shell like a hermit crab, until the shell broke and all their gloopy insides spilled out. It was messy work, certainly, but relatively speaking it passed quite quickly, and so, as Clarence the bartender was only just putting the bowls of pork and beans in the microwave, Jahanara and Glorfindel found themselves once more at the control panel for the airlock. The decompression system worked such that when one had requested the door open at the bar end of the space station, they then had to wait for confirmation from the landing pad that it was safe to leave. Given that time was moving at 1/100th of a second for both the insectoid and her spherical companion, and that the last we saw of the landing pad's parking valet and airlock operator, the small green blob, he was smeared rather gratuitously across the walls of his office, the pair had plenty of time to talk as they waited.
What's he gonna do then?
Quizzed Glorfindel, still struggling and failing to wipe themselves completely free of viscera.
You're surely not gonna try and sell it. Not with the whole clout of the Council of Sentience after you.
Well, I mean, I wasn't going to say. It's all very hush-hush, of course, Jahanara demurred. But I do happen to know of somewhere where I might just find a buyer.
Please don't take this the wrong way, Khan, but you're off your bloody rocker if you think someone will take on that sort of heat.
Jahanara considered this for a moment. She tried the airlock's call button again and blinked her 100 eyes as if thinking about something entirely different to the conversation at hand. Presently, she clicked a grin at Glorfindel. Well, you're not wrong, Glorfold pal. I already got given the boot, quite literally, by the permaclubbers on Cascada 9. Even the feral mudsplats of the large Magellanic cloud didn't want it, despite my pointing out that by owning something prized so highly by the council, they would surely make their neighbours jealous. And you know what the mudsplats of the large Magellanic cloud are like about their neighbours. Glorfindel nodded. I suspect I gave the game away when I tried selling this thing to the sub-council of impertinence, pitching them the idea that it might attract visitors away from the Council of Sentience's Museum of Everything, and instead drum up visitor numbers to the sub-council's Museum of Almost Nothing. Glorfindel shook their orb. Alas, continued Jahanara, I'd almost given up hope, but then I thought of the one place no one in their right minds would ever think of looking. She clicked excitedly. Trying the call button again, there came a beep of red light, followed slowly by the hissing of the airlock. Gradually, inch by endless inch, the door began to slide away. Jahanara checked her bum bag, flapped her wings to settle the dust on them, and licked a little goo from her 73rd eye. In fact, she continued, it's kind of why I'm here.
Here?
The orb scoffed.
At the arse end of the universe?
Not quite the arse end, though, is it?
Well,
replied Glorfindel.
I suppose not, if you count.
They stopped mid-sentence, catching a glimmer of confirmation in Jahanara's gaze.
You mean?
Oh yeah, I mean Earth. The freelancer laughed widely as the doorway slowly widened. Glorfindel was incredulous.
But what do you mean Earth? It's been abandoned for...
They trailed off again, for in the air between they and Jahanara, the insectoid's thoughts had manifested. Glorfindel concentrated and saw what Jahanara knew, what she had discovered about that pale blue dot, long thought abandoned, long consigned to the history podcasts as a blip in space-time at the arse end of the universe. They saw the plan formulating in Jahanara's mind to find the so-called octopus people of Earth, a whole race on the verge of intellectual awakening, on the brink of conscious enlightenment, and, like Prometheus had taught humans the way of fire, to bring the octopuses the one tool in the theoretical multiverse that would allow them to leapfrog their evolutionary development. Jahanara watched their pal, the extraneously conscious light orb, watching the invisible manifestation of her thoughts, and tried to withhold the thought that, after having bestowed upon these earthling cephalopods the bountiful chalice of intellect, she might rule over them like a queen, like the captain of her own hyper-intelligent Starfleet. But if you've ever been told not to think of, say, a crocodile eating a child, then you'll know that the first thing you think of is a crocodile eating a child. And so it was that Glorfindel saw, plain as day, the monarchic intentions of their one-time colleague, Jahanara Khan. And they quailed, their mists turning a sorry brown.
Quantum quasars, Nara, you don't know when to quit, do you? You should leave the brainiac here for the last of the council's goons to find, and you should make yourself bloody scarce. Building a subservient army of intelligent octopods is hardly keeping a low profile now, is it?
The doors of the airlock finally clacked into position. Jahanara looked at Glorfindel with something that might once, in a distant past, have passed for shame.
You've already made up your mind, haven't you?
Jahanara bared the gummy roof of her mouth.
Bloody hell,
swore the light orb.
Right, fuck it. Let's get going then. I want to put several light years between me and this sorry excuse for a space station before our pork and beans come through the heat.
And just like that, as one often finds given the random chaos of the multiverse, Glorfindel's words brought into being the actualization of their meaning, which is to say, The microwave behind the bar, having survived the destructive exploits of the mercenaries long enough to carry out its one final task, tinged.